Welcome to Data in OutSystems. In this session, we'd like to discuss the different types of data that are available in OutSystems. Entities and static entities are available, and they have to have identifiers and certain types of attributes, and they have actions associated with them. Once we have a number of entities, we can go ahead and begin creating entity relationships and creating entity diagrams that visualize how those entities are relating. We also have structures, which are complex types, and those complex types are held in memory, and they can have entities and other structures and their own attributes. So they can be a conglomerate of any types of data structures that are available. And then we have individual variables, because at different times we need to be able to move or share the data that we have been working with, and variables will go ahead and do that. So let's get started looking at some more of the details. So inside of OutSystems, we do have the data layer. And inside the data layer, at the very top, we have the capability of creating our entity diagrams, and we can give them a name and then create whatever type of diagram of the entities that we have so we can display the relationships and other types of things. We have entities, and entities can be of two types. They're either database entities or local storage entities. So database entities are stored in the database on the server side, and local storage will actually be storing entities on the devices that we're dealing with. So when we're dealing with mobile and we have client devices, local storage will have the entities being persisted on the device itself. Structures are going to be the complex types that we can keep in memory. And then we do have two other types of data, site properties, which are sort of cross-application shared sets of settings or data, and different types of resources. And that can be a number of other types of data. But when we're talking about structured data and other types of things, we have our structures, we have our entities, and then the entity diagrams help describe some of that. So when we work with data, most of the time when we're defining the data and working with it, it's inside of the data tab, the data layer. So how do we begin to create entities? Well, it's fairly simple. We can right-click on entities, or we can right-click on database entities, and we can go ahead and ask to add an entity. And we just have to give it a name, and once we give the entity a name, it's ready to go. We do have some other variables like is it public, which means will it be shared with any other modules outside of this module, and then would it be exposed read-only? So would people be able to read the data but not update it? So entities, all entities have these two extra properties that help us define whether or not that will be shared. So here we have a customer entity, so once we've created an entity, typically we have to give it some more definition, and that would be what attributes belong with this entity. And when we define the attributes, we give them a name, we can give them a label, but in general, the most important thing is what type of data is it? And will it be a mandatory piece of data? So do we need for the customer absolutely to have their first name? And we may decide that no, that is not something that's mandatory that we have to have. Now when we select the data types, OutSystems has a number of different basic data types. There's text and phone numbers, emails, lots of numeric data. We have booleans for logic, number of date times, and then we have sort of the binary data of blobs, and then we have identifiers for other types of entities, which will be references that we're going to use. So you can see some examples of all the different basic data types and what the default values will be. Now, when we're defining an attribute, if we give an attribute a name, OutSystems will try to infer the type for you. So by default, it will give it a text type if it can't figure it out. But if it can figure out something from the way you have named your entity, it will do that. So if you give some sort of name with a count at the end or a number at the end, it'll turn it into an integer. If you gave it something like a birth date, that has date inside of it, so it'll know that it's a date. So here are a lot of different examples of the types of things that if you give an entity's attribute a particular type of name, it will go ahead and try to figure out the data type for you. So the platform's just trying to suggest things that make sense and make us more productive by doing these things a little bit faster. So here we can see our entity, and we've added a number of attributes to it: first name, last name, email, and phone number, and these would automatically have been typed to email and phone number. But in this particular instance, we're looking at the actions. When we create an entity will have an identifier. It will have all the attributes that we go ahead and create for it, and then it will have these things called entity actions. And these are the basic CRUD capabilities that are going to allow us to store and access the information about this entity in the database. So we can create the customer, we can create or update the customer, we can update the customer, we can get the customer for update, we can just get the customer or delete the customer. So again, we have the creates, the gets for the reads, the updates, and the deletes. So normal CRUD type of stuff. This is just another set of details about those entity actions, and the fact that if you're going to do a create, we have to give it the details of what the record is. So if it's a client, what are all the client and the attributes that we have, and once it creates it, it creates the identifier for that record and it sends us back that. So these are just some descriptions of all the entity actions and the types of inputs and outputs that you can expect for each one of these entity actions. And when it creates it, depending on what you give it the entity, what you name the entity, that's what the entity actions will be called. So here it's update, and for us it was update client, get client, because that's just the naming convention. So that takes care of entities. That shows us that we can go ahead and create those. So what's the difference between an entity and a static entity? And you can see that the icons are different. We have a red stripe down the middle, and the name is different. So if the entities are being persisted, then that sort of makes sense. Static entities implies that they can't be changed. And that is what we're dealing with. So when we create a static entity, we're going to create a static entity that represents some set of data, and then we're going to create the instances, and we're going to call them records, of those types of things. So here we can create a static entity, and if we call that static entity country, and here we're saying, okay, we're going to have something called country, and the description is we're going to create a few of the world's countries so we could go ahead and reference them. And you can see down below, it already begins looking for the types of records. So this makes a little more sense when we look inside of the data tab in more detail. If we're in a static entity, the static entity will have an identifier and it will have certain types of attributes. But then it has records. And what this basically means is that each of these records will have an identifier with these attributes in it, and then it will not be able to be changed. So when we say it's static, these are all going to be defined, and the values of these, once they are defined at design time, in development time, they will not be able to be changed at runtime. And from what we just talked about a second ago about the entity actions, you can see that this is static in the fact that the only entity action we have for our country is to get country. So we can't update it, we can't create new ones, we can't do any of that because the static entity has already defined the list of records and the types of attributes that they have. So if you really step back for a second from a development perspective and you think about this, what we've really done is we've created a set of data that can't be changed, but that we can use, and it's sort of we have a record and some information about it. So this is basically an enumeration that can return us different types of information about whichever part of the enumerate we select. So in this particular case, we see we have Portugal highlighted. So when we look down below in the details, so this is one of our static entities records, Portugal is the identifier, and then the label's Portugal. This is the first record in the list of records. It's active, and we have decided to add a country code. And then this will be the country code access modifier. So here we have static entity information that can help us sort of retrieve this type of information whenever we need it. So if you need enumerations and things like that, static entities can be a great way to go ahead and use those. So that helps us define our entities and our static entities. But what we may find is that one entity may have some sort of relationship with another entity. So it's rare that one set of data will be enough by itself. And a good example here is we may have books, and the books may have been published by some sort of publisher. They will have some sort of author. Um, so each book has one or more authors, and then an author may have written one or more books, and an author may have more details about themselves, which we call their biography. So these are a set of entities that are all related to each other, and the types of relationships that they have are important because all of this data is very related to one another. So it is important that all of this data fits together and it makes sense. So how would we begin trying to create these relationships and make sure that everything is working properly? Well, the first thing we would do is create the entities, and we've already been able to do that. But one important thing is, we already mentioned it, but an entity will have an identifier. So when we go in to look at the entity, the first attribute should always be the ID, and it's the identifier. It always has the red stripe down the middle, and that's going to be the primary key. So when we talk about entities, they're persisted in tables in the database. So this ID is our identifier. It also is the primary key of the author table in the database. By default, the ID is a long integer. It is mandatory, and it will auto number so that we guarantee the uniqueness. And you can change the type of an identifier so that it doesn't have to be a long integer. You could change it back to integer or text or something else, but you do have to manage to make sure that it's going to be unique. So one other thing that's important is sometimes when you think about creating more advanced data structures and other types of things, you may say that we're creating some sort of table or set of entities that have a composite set of keys. Inside of OutSystems, we only have simple primary keys, and it will always be the identifier. So once we have an entity and we have an identifier, then when we have another entity that we want to create a relationship with and be able to reference the other entity from this entity, then we're going to have a foreign key, and for that foreign key we're going to need a reference attribute. And the reference attribute has a blue stripe down the middle with a little arrow. So here if we look at the books have a title, a publication date, an edition, and the books have a publisher ID. So there's a publisher that is an entity, and it's identified, and we know where those publishers are, and we know details about them. But all those publishers have identifiers. So we can go ahead and say that this book was published by a particular publisher by including the publisher ID, and then we have the relationship where we can then navigate the relationship and get the information about the publisher of this book. So is mandatory referenced attributes will be checked by the database to make sure that they are there. So if we take publisher ID and we say it's mandatory, then if a book is created, it's going to have a publisher ID so it knows to complete that relationship. And if we create some sort of attribute and we give it a name and we put ID at the end with a capital I and a little d, it will always go ahead and look for an entity and create the entity type if we want. So again, it does some nice things to kind of keep everything the way it should be. Now, once we have relationships between entities, there are different types of relationships, and they will be diagrammed differently in the entity diagram editor. And they sort of represent different types of things. So we said earlier that the author may have a biography, and the author has an ID to define and identify who they are. When we go to create the biography, which may be their picture and more information about them, if we go ahead and change the identifier of the biography to be the same identifier as the author, so we actually say we want to use the author ID as our ID for the biography, then what we've done is we've created a one-to-one relationship. These two entities are sharing the same identifier, and sometimes the biography entity is referred to as an extension entity. So the author is the original entity, biography is extending it and adding these extra attributes to that entity. So the good news here is we can go ahead and create these relatively easily by creating new entities and giving it the ID of the thing we're trying to extend. So those are one-to-one relationships. Now sometimes we don't have just one-to-one relationships, sometimes we have one-to-many. So we may have a publisher that is able to publish books, and the book identifies who publishes that particular book, and the publisher can publish many books. So when we say there's a one-to-many relationship here, one publisher can publish many books. So when we look at the relationship, we see the line being drawn, and then when we see the connector at the end having these three lines to go ahead and describe that, that implies the many relationship. Sometimes this relationship is referred to as a master detail relationship, and the fact that the detail entity references the master entity so that we understand, one of these things references many of the others. So that's a one-to-many relationship. And then finally, we may have something that goes one step beyond that, which sometimes is referred to as a many-to-many relationship. And what that means is that we may have a book that has one or more authors, and an author may create one or more books. So we have a many-to-many relationship between authors and books. But there's no way to be able to create those relationships back and forth directly with each other. So what we do instead is we create what is often referred to as a junction or a reference table. So a junction entity or reference table will go ahead and sit in the middle, and it will say that there are book authors. So there is a book, and we know who the author of that book is. And by having this intermediate table, we now know that an author could be part of a particular book author, and the book, any book, could be a book author. But this book author, there could be 3 book authors for a book, and there could be 5 books that are related to one given author. So here we have a one-to-many relationship between author and book authors. We have a one-to-many relationship between books and book authors. So when we follow the navigation, we actually get a many-to-many relationship between these two things. So we could go ahead and easily set this up to be able to have that type of relationship as well. Now sometimes when we set up these relationships, people will refer to, well, do you have referential integrity? So that if I'm referencing another entity, what happens if that entity gets deleted? Do I need to have this entity be deleted, or what happens? Inside of OutSystems, we have what we call delete rules, and we can either protect the referenced entity, we can delete it, or we can ignore the fact that this has occurred. So we wouldn't actually care that the other entity has gone away. So for protect, we would basically say don't allow the deletion of referenced entities unless nothing else points to this entity. So if we had an entity that had relationships to others and those were still valid, then it wouldn't do any of the deletes. We could also set it to delete, which says that if we see a referenced entity being deleted, delete all of the other referenced entities that go with it. So this just gives you a way to look at the relationships that you've created and say, are these tightly coupled relationships that need to exist or not exist together, or is the relationship a little bit looser and we can sort of ignore some of the things that occur? Last, as far as entities and other types of things, there is an entity editor. So if we double click on any of our entities and we open them up in the entity editor, one of the things that's available is not just the name, the description, and the attributes, but indexes. Because we know these entities are being persisted in a database, these indexes, this index area, would allow us to create an index on that table so that we could go ahead and try to speed up the retrieval of that type of data. There may be a cost to that, a little bit of an extra writing and overhead for storage to be able to create these indexes and do that, but it can do a number of other things as well. So we could create indexes with one or more types of attributes, and we could ask that to be unique so that we know there will be certain types of things that we don't have duplicate records inside the database. So it can be very nice. By default, anytime we reference some of the others, so if we have a book and it has an author ID, then we'll go ahead and have a index for any of the references that we're going to have, because we would expect that we may need to retrieve those. And here at the very end, if we had all of these entities and we created all these relationships, so we can see that our biography has a one-to-one relationship with the author. We have this many-to-many relationship between the authors and the books, and then we have a one-to-many relationship between the publisher and the books. So we can see that all of those relationships exist, and the little icons tell us a little bit about those relationships. And then the delete rule also shows up in the color of the links. So here we might say, hey, when the author gets deleted, delete the biography as well, because it wouldn't make sense to have a biography with no primary author. If it's a dark link, then we're going to protect it and not do it. And if we have a light gray link, then we can go ahead and ignore that. If the publisher disappears, the book would still exist, and we may or may not remember who the publisher is, and that's probably okay. And if we deleted all the books, the publisher may not care, so we'd still want data about the publisher, and that may make sense. So entity diagrams can show us a lot of information, not only about the entities, but their relationships and the types of delete rules that we have enforced upon them. So that does a lot with entities. We've described how we can create entities and static entities, how we can create all these relationships, but occasionally we're going to need data that's coming from different places, but we only need it in memory. We don't actually need it to be persisted to the database, and we want something fairly complex. Where would this come up? Well, a lot of times we use structures to go ahead and hold on to data that's coming from services. And whether they're web services or RESTful services, we want to be able to hold the data that's coming in. That data may be complex and have a very rich structure, so we don't want to limit it to just basic types like the entities have. So we can come down inside of the data tab to the structures area, and we could say, I have a combined customer info structure that has information about the customer, information about the country, and some other attributes. And when you see the small green icons that look like the entity icon, it's a complex type, and it can refer to the actual entity type. And then when we have these look like the attributes from the entities, so these are just attributes of a structure. And we could go ahead and create these, and these will have a basic type. So our structures can have multiple structures or entities inside of them, as well as other attributes. So it truly is the most flexible way to create a data structure definition inside of OutSystems. Now, once we have all of our entities and other types of things, we may need to use some of this information in either the screens that we're creating, in some of the actions and the logic that we're creating. So we need to have variables. And we can create variables to store different types of information. Variables can either be basic types or compound types. And once the variable exists, the variable will have a scope. So the variable will be attached to something, and that will be the scope in which the variable lives. So it's fairly easy to think about when we begin saying, okay, let's say we have an action, we have a server action, so we have a set of logic that's going to run on the server, and inside the server action it needs an input parameter. So that will create a variable for us, and that will be the input variable. We'll also have the ability to have output parameters. So all of those output parameters will have some sort of output variable. And if we need variables that exist during this action's logic being run, but it's not an input and an output, we can just add a local variable. So variables are there. Once we create a variable, the variable will need a type. So we can go choose one of the basic types, or if the variable is going to be holding the information from an entity, it could go ahead and hold an entity or a structure so that it has that type of information. So inside of this section, we've covered a lot. We've talked about entities and static entities. We've shown all the relationships that can occur. We've talked about structures and variables. So this is more about defining and making sure that we have the data that we need where we need it. At different times, we're then going to have to reference this data and be able to retrieve it. So we're going to discuss that in a separate section, but hopefully here you've gotten a feel for the types of data that we can persist, the types of data that we can have in memory, and how we deal with variables, so that you'll be able to retrieve information from entities and other things because they've been defined well and you know what they are.